So here we are within the After Effects workspace, and there are a lot of panels, a lot of options, and it can be a little bit intimidating when we first look at it for the first time. But what we're going to do is we're going to jump into our project here, and we're going to examine each of these panels as the need arises. The first thing that we see here is in the main composition panel. You can see it's called Composition. There is currently nothing to see. That's because we haven't created a composition yet, and that is the very first thing that we must do when we are working on a new project. And so let's do that. Let's create a new composition. I'm going to go to the Composition drop-down menu, select New Composition, and in this dialog box we're going to change the name of this composition to Ball. And right now I'm using 720 pixels by 480 pixels aspect ratio. That is, if I click on this presets window, that is this value right here, NTSC-DV. That is Standard North American Digital Video. And I'm just going to select that. Now this pixel aspect ratio, I'm going to change that to square pixels. Square pixels is what our computers use, and so we want to make sure that we are working within those square pixels. There are some discrepancies between how different screens display pixels. Some television screens use different ratios for their pixels, and that's why there are these different options here. But we'll just stick within square pixels. The frame rate is 29.97 frames per second, and digital video is 30 frames per second. So why the difference? Well, this is the frame rate that North American television works at. We could change that to 30 frames per second without any real problem, but if you want, you can use 29.97. It's up to you whether or not you want to use 30 or not. Here, let's change it to 30. We'll just keep this nice and easy. Resolution will maintain full resolution. Now here in the time code, it's showing us we have the start time code. Well, we're going to start at 000. But what did each one of these, what does this actual time code refer to? Well, for the most part, it's fairly straightforward. We're looking at the first 0 represents the number of hours. The second set of zeros represents the number of minutes. This represents the number of seconds. And these last set of zeros, what do they represent? Is that tenths of a second? Well, actually, no. This is representing the number of frames that are being shown. Currently, we've got this set to 30 frames per second. So what we would see here is this start at 0, 0 and move all the way up, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 29. And then when it gets to 30, it would turn over and add another second to our time code. We're going to keep this duration at 10 seconds for this project. So make sure that that is set to 10. And finally, we're going to change the background color, or leave the background color at black. If you want to, you can just click on that swatch panel and swatch field and change the background to any color that you'd like. I'm going to say OK with that. And essentially, we're going to use those values. I'm going to say OK. And there is our composition. Currently, it's at 100%, but I can change that. I'm going to change the view to fit to 100%, and that reduces it in size just a little bit so I can see the entire composition. And there we go. There is what we are going to be working within. But we don't have anything to work on. We don't have any shapes or anything else to move around in our composition. So let's create that next. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Layer drop-down menu, and I'm going to select New. And you can see that there's a number of different types of layers that we can use here, and some of them are quite interesting. Light, so we can have in a camera, and null objects. What's that? Well, we'll talk about that later. But the one we want right now is this one here, Shape Layer. So I'm going to select that. And you can see that there's a couple things that have happened here that have been updated. We'll go into what is down here. This is our timeline panel here, but you can see we have a new layer in our timeline panel, and it's called Shape Layer 1. But currently there's no shape. We actually haven't made a shape yet, so we need to do that next. If you come up to this section here, you can see this is our toolbar, and some of these tools are fairly self-explanatory, but some of them are a little bit more obscure. We'll get into those. But the one we want to focus on right now is this. Well, if I click and hold on these shape tools here, you can see that there is a number of shape tools available to us. The one we want is this one here, the Ellipse Tool. We just want to make a ball. And I'm going to hold down the Shift button as I click and drag out a ball that looks something like this. And there we go. There's the ball that we're going to be animating in our bouncing ball effect. Now, just before we move on from this, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we do have the ability to change the color of this ball right up here. You can see that there's the fill option here, and then there's the swatch color. If I click on that, I can make that some color. I'm going to keep this fairly light so we can see it against the black background. But you can make it any color that you would like. And so let's quickly take a look at what's happened to our timeline panel down here. We can see we have something called Shape Layer 1. Well, Shape Layer 1 is not very descriptive. Let's change the name of that. Now we change the name of our layers by clicking on them so that they're highlighted. You can see that this is targeted now. And I have to hold down or just press the return button once. And once I do that, then you can see that that becomes a field that I can now change the name of. I'm going to just type in ball, hit return again to accept that change. Now you can see that there is a couple of different things well, a few things that we should probably pay some attention to. Let's look over to the right-hand side of our timeline panel and see what's going on here. You can see that we have this little yellow doohickey thing that I can drag back and forth. This is actually called the current timeline indicator or current time indicator, and this basically tells me where I am currently on the timeline. And moving this back and forth is actually called scrubbing the timeline. If you hear someone say scrub the timeline, that just means bring your current time indicator to some other position. And you can see that we have the 10 seconds of the duration of our timeline labeled here. We have 0.0 seconds, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds, all the way to 10 seconds at the end. Underneath that, we have this gray bar with these 2 yellow tabs at the end, and that is actually called our work area. Now, we are not, we have the ability to work on smaller sections of our timeline. We don't have to work with the entire 10 seconds of all the entire timeline. In fact, our bouncing ball effect is really just going to occur what we're going to do next. It's going to occur over these first 2 seconds. So I could hover over the yellow tab at the end of my work area and just drag that in just to about, just so that it encompasses the first couple of seconds of my timeline. Underneath that, you can see that this ball has what's called a layer indicator. This is that blue bar here. And what that indicates is whenever you see that blue bar along our timeline, that means the object associated with that layer is visible. And currently, my current time indicator is set here at 1 second and 7 frames. Watch what happens if I hover my cursor over the end of this layer indicator. I get this double-headed arrow. And if I click and start dragging, I can actually trim my layer indicator to the point where it's actually occurring after my current time indicator. So that is no longer visible. If I drag my current time indicator to above the, on top of that layer indicator, suddenly that object now appears again. I'm going to drag that to the beginning so that it's visible during the entire length of my timeline. I could also do this with the end of my layer indicator. I could drag it so that it disappears. And this is actually a very easy way of creating animations. We can have things appear and disappear on our timeline just by trimming the layer indicator. But I want this to be to occur for the entire length of my timeline here. And I'm just going to bring my current time indicator back to the beginning here. The next thing I want to look at is the transform properties underneath our layer over here, this layer ball. And if we twirl down this disclosure triangle, we see a list of 5 different properties. I call these the cardinal properties. These are the main properties that we can use to transform and make animations with our objects on the stage here. Let's just take a quick look at them in order. And the first one that we see here is something called anchor point. And anchor point is the point around which all transformations take place. And we can really see this here if I come over here to the scale property and make some changes. Now, this scale property here has 2 values. We see 100% for the X value, that's the horizontal, and the Y, and that's the vertical shape of this object here. If I scrub them, one of them, you can see that because they're linked with that chain link, they move in unison. But if I'm just going to hit Command Z here, if I unlink that these properties, I can make individual changes. And watch how this changes you can see that it's making its scale change around that central point, or that anchor point there. Now, imagine for a second this is a rubber ball and hitting the ground, and it would make a deformation, but it would make that deformation around the center point, around the bottom center of that ball where it hits the ground. And so we would need to change the location of this anchor point. So let's do that. Now there's a couple different ways we can do that. We can come down here to the slider and make changes here like that. But the way I prefer to do that is to come up to my toolbar and select the Pan Behind tool. Now that Pan Behind tool also has a number of functions. One of them is to relocate our anchor point. So I'm just going to select that tool and click on this crosshairs right here. That's our anchor point. And I'm going to relocate that right to the bottom center of our ball. And that'll be important as we continue on with this animation. Now, the next property we see here is our position property, and you can see that there are in fact two values here. They're separated by this comma right here. And again, these are the x coordinates and the y coordinates. Essentially, it's saying where is the anchor point for this object. And here it's at 354 pixels from the left of our composition, and 217 pixels from the top of our composition. And that is, again, we are going to be making changes to this property here as we continue on with our animation. Again, the scale property, usually they are linked, like I say, like that. But the way we're going to be doing our transformation of this ball, we are actually going to leave this unlinked, right, like that. And we'll do something with this in just a bit. And rotation. Rotation, again, has two values here. The first value here, 0x, is the number of rotations. And then this value here is just the percentage, or the sort of the degree of rotation. You can see if I rotate this like that, you can see how that ball is transforming. And finally, opacity. We have 0 to 100% opacity. We can set that and animate that as we like. All right, well, in our next video, we are going to actually start getting this ball moving. We're going to start creating some keyframes and creating some animation.